Good morning, everyone. If you can hear me fine, just message in the chat box. I just want to make sure the mic is sounding good. How's everyone doing this morning? Is everyone doing all right? I know this was a really big week. A lot of content we covered. It was kind of 2 weeks. I tried to drip some of the content to you guys over time so you wouldn't get overwhelmed, because there was not only a lot of video to watch, but a lot of work for you guys to do on your paintings. So I know it was kind of a tough week. I know a lot of you said you were really challenged by the color stage, and I just wanted to remind everyone that you don't have to rush through this stage. I know some of you were a little worried that you were behind or you didn't get to the features, and that's okay. If you listened to the session last week, the Q&A, I said that you don't really need to get the features done. Just concentrate on the major planes of the face and get as much done as possible. This first layer is like where the bulk of the work is done. So it can be really tough to get done in like just 1 week or one session, which is why I kind of spread it out and I'm giving you guys more time. The more time you take with this layer, the easier each subsequent layer is going to get. So, and there's going to be less and less work for you to do over the coming weeks. So that's why if you guys need more time to work on this first pass, take as much time as you need, because the refining layers are pretty minimal. I mean, I do some work, as you'll see in the video that was released today. I do a second pass over the major planes, and then I'll do a second pass over the features, and I'll release that a little bit later in the coming week. But really, it's because I took as much time as needed in that first color pass. So don't rush yourself, and if things have gotten in the way, like life likes to do, just take your time with this first color pass, because it's really kind of essential for moving forward. And if you rush through it, you risk losing your drawing in the features especially, and we don't want that. So take your time and don't feel bad if you didn't get as far as you wanted to for this critique. So we're just going to talk about where your colors are sitting, and I noticed quite a few of you had trouble or expressed frustration with trying to photograph your painting accurately. So I'm going to do a little mini tutorial, and I'll release that later on this, kind of in the middle of the week before our next critique. And so just so that you guys have, I'll show you like the settings I use on my camera, and I'll show you how I kind of set up my painting under the light, and hopefully that will help you get a little bit better of a photo that you feel represents your painting as it feels like in life, because I don't want to be telling you guys to correct things if these photographs aren't like an accurate representation of, you know, what your painting looks like. So that's just a little bit of a technical hoop we have to jump through. So I'll see if a tutorial can help you guys with that a little bit. So welcome, and I'm going to go ahead and just jump into the critiques. So Kathy, we're going to start with you. And I appreciate everyone who submitted the work. I know you guys, some of you felt like you needed just a little bit more time. And at the end of this stream, we're going to talk a little bit about what to expect in the coming weeks, as far as your critiques and what kind of homework you need to kind of work on for the week. I'm going to try to lighten your load this coming week a little bit. I grouped the lessons for 6 and 7, the week 6 and 7, there again, because I want you guys to have as much time as possible. So I'm going to kind of rearrange our critique schedule just a little bit so that we will still have an extra critique next week, but it won't be very much work between now and then. So I'll kind of email everyone as well about that, just so everyone who isn't watching this understands. But let's go ahead and get started. So Kathy, did you have any specific questions? I know you said that you got into painting the left eye, but you didn't get to the right eye or the lips. I did release that video a few days ago on the right eye and the lips. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that, go ahead and watch that, and then you can progress on your painting. But this is looking really, really nice. I think you've captured her likeness really well. And I like that you have such a warm color here in the, let me get a darker pen, here in the eye, because when you go back on top and you start to paint in those darker values, it's going to have a really nice glow kind of beneath it. So that's really, really good. Now, I just want to ask you, Kathy, really quickly, does this color, when you're kind of looking at the picture, does it feel like how your painting feels in real life? Or does it feel like a little too yellow or pinkish? I'm just trying to sort out if the photograph feels true to how the painting feels to you when you're working on it. So not compared to the photograph here right now, but just to how does this painting feel compared to when you're working on it from life? Because I want to make sure the camera's capturing as close as possible. It feels too pink, and the shadows, are the shadows dark enough, or do you feel like it's darker? So what I can do is modify the picture here a little bit. Let's bring the curves down just a little bit. Let's bring that shadow a little darker. Let me know if that looks good. Okay, and then it's looking a little pink. So tell me if the contrast looks good now. And let me adjust some of the color balance. So if it's too pink, we want to take out some of that a little bit. So I'm going to remove just a touch of pink, just a touch of the red. Now, does it feel like it needs to be more yellow? Compared to what it looks like? Because I can kind of take away some of the blue and push it over towards the yellow, or I can leave that kind of where it was. It's subtle, but I want to make sure I'm not telling you to completely change your colors. Is that better? Okay. Yeah, if there's anything else that needs some changes, just let me know. Not sure. Okay. It looks, I think it looks a little bit less distorted as far as my sense of the color goes. Okay, so we'll just go from here. And one thing I want to say to everyone is that don't judge your flesh tones until you get the features painted, all of them, including the mouth. And if you haven't watched my video where I painted the right eye and the lips, you will notice how adding those areas has completely changed the feeling of my portrait. Before, she felt like a ghost. It didn't seem like she had much color in her skin tones. But as soon as I really hit those red zones with a little bit more color, it really started to pop. So, and part of that is moving from the transition of the kind of gray underpainting. And then, so you might find, like, if you're painting a cool light photo, like our example, like my demo, then moving from this cool underpainting to a cool color stage can kind of feel ghostly until you get those warm color zones in. So just make sure you don't go through and fuss too much with the large planes of the face until you've finished painting in the features. Then we can go through, look at how they're all working together, and make adjustments and tweaks in those in that second pass. So like I said, don't judge it too soon. Really, all paintings are a balance when it comes to color. It's a balance of, what colors are adjacent, It's really important to get all of your underpainting covered up with at least one color layer, even if it's not 100% accurate, just kind of going for that basic, estimate, because it will, having these warm colors here, and having the cool colors here is totally going to throw your sense of the color here. And we're working with a somewhat limited palette, so we want our colors to relate. And if your colors are relating on your palette mixtures, then they will relate in your painting. So just kind of trust that process a little bit, and we'll enhance colors in those upper layers regardless. So just don't get too fussy with your skin tones in the large planes until you've finished blocking out the entire painting, including like the hair and the the shirt and everything, making sure all of your underpainting is covered. Okay, so let's get into some of the skin tones here. I think you have really beautiful skin tones. I think one of the things that might help enhance her skin tones a little bit is making the background a little bit more of this bluish white, because it really complements and adds some coolness around her. And I just see some of this warm peeking through, and that's fine in certain areas. But I feel like if you pushed that a little bit cooler in some areas, it would help. Another thing is that I'm noticing her shadow feels very red, and here it has like this red undertone, and I realize she does have a little bit of that warmth kind of bouncing through. But let's just take some color selections and compare the two. My feeling is, like you said, she feels maybe a little more pink, and she has a little more yellow. Now don't worry about that, because we can go through, and you will go through in that second pass with more yellow influence, and I can even talk to you about doing a glaze of yellow when you're oiling out. So let me jump back to that real quick though. So let's go back to, let's take a couple of color samples here. I'm going to try and find like an average that feels like the color that you have there. So you have kind of two colors going on here. You have a reflected light color, and then you have this cooler transition that's kind of a lavender. Oops. The color picker is kind of tricky. Let's see, maybe something like that. I know you have some cooler zones in here. I actually really like this transition color that you have. It's kind of this cool pink. It's real nice. And that could be balanced out by just doing a glaze. So I'll talk to you about that here in just a second. But let's take a quick look at some of her colors. So that darkest color is around that zone. Her reflected light. Let me see if I can find. I do sense that warmth there. Just a few areas, but maybe it's just subtly more red. Yeah, it's not quite picking up in the color picker. We'll just take a sample there, and then let's look at one of the transition tones. So you can see that the color shift here, you just have a little bit more red in yours. And so one thing you can do is, if we took something like an amber glaze, let me grab a more transparent brush here. Let's try something like that. And let me pick a color that feels a little bit like, a color I'm thinking of right now is transparent red oxide. If you don't have it, it's also called transparent iron oxide. There's a few different names for it, but it's a really beautiful color when you glaze it. It kind of turns into a pale amber. And sometimes if I notice I did a painting and let's say the color shift just feels too much one direction and I want to warm it before I go back in and paint, when I do my oiling out, I will sometimes glaze with very, very pale, but a very thin glaze. I will glaze when I oil out that section, and then I'll paint into that glaze. So it's kind of like you're laying down this couch of a slightly warmer glaze, so any colors you paint back into it's going to mix with that glaze and warm just a little bit. And that might be beneficial for this painting in certain areas. So let me see how possibly doing something like that would help. So transparent iron oxide is kind of an orange color, and it looks somewhere around this. It's real dark, but when you glaze it, so out of the tube it looks like it's down in this range, but when you glaze it, it takes on something, it depends on how heavy you make your glaze, but it takes on just a little bit of this color. So let's just see how glazing, of course it won't have an opacity, that's the only problem with digital painting. It doesn't behave the same way actual paint behaves. But let's just see what doing a little bit of the glaze does over some of these colors. And I'm just kind of testing here to see how it might help your painting. Now, one thing I'm noticing is that your shadow, you might want to take your shadow color more towards the blue zone. But so what happens when you're glazing is like your color might, I'll just do this over your portrait here. Just apply a very, very subtle glaze. It kind of brings some of that warmth out of her skin, and you're going to notice it mostly with the lights. So where glazes really enhance over the light masses, and you can even selectively use the glaze in those areas. But you can see how just going in with a slight glaze of that warmth is going to bring it closer to her skin tones. The only area where you probably won't want to apply the glaze is towards those shadows. The yellow can balance out some of that violet. It'll kind of cancel it out. So that might be beneficial, but I do feel like her shadows take on a little bit more of a cool blue cast. So you might take and spot glaze those areas with a little bit of a mixture of blue. And I'm not talking about a real heavy glaze. I'm talking about just, you know, a real thin tint to the oil that you apply or the oleo gel that you apply. And it's just a nice way to quickly shift your painting a little bit closer to what you want. And then you can go in and paint more direct with some of those mixtures, and you can adjust some of your shadow color mixtures. So if we took some of the colors here, and I'm just going to push these a little bit more blue-gray. In these halftone zones, it starts to take on that nice kind of yellow versus blue. And I think what happened is you went kind of pink versus, or like kind of like a yellow versus violet. And that can be the case, but sometimes it depends on the person's inherent skin tone. It might favor blue violet rather than a red violet. And I think you've kind of kept your shadows red violet. So if you push them a little bit more blue violet, then you're going to capture a little bit more of that inherent skin tone that she has. It's real subtle, but you can see how it starts to, when you zoom out, starts to pick up her natural kind of tonality a little bit closer. Like I said before, covering up these areas is going to make a big difference. And I'm just going to put a block of color here and here, just so you can get a sense of how these things, and actually that's something to pay attention to as well in this portrait, is that her shirt is bouncing this color into that shadow and into this shadow here on her neck. So when that could be also why there's more of a blue influence as opposed to a red violet. So even scumbling like a dark gray. Like if you took ultramarine blue with a little bit of transparent red oxide and a touch of maybe ochre and white. Be careful about adding white in your shadows, but in this case she's in this light environment and it's kind of pushing back in, so just a very small amount. And you just scumbled that over your shadows, I think it would push it towards that kind of cool gray. Another thing that will help is just making sure you get the rest of this blocked out and get rid of that warm underpainting. That's going to help already just balance out the whole portrait. And in her hair, I think because my model has such a dark red undertone, I think you're going to want to start to add some more kind of ochre tones to her and more neutral browns to her hair. So maybe find an average. You can see her hair here is kind of a little bit more like a dull brown gray. You might take a little bit of that. Your hair might have gotten a little dark, and that red is really setting off. You can see how gray that is by comparison. So just start shifting a little bit. She has some of those red tones, but they're a little bit lighter. She kind of has like a dirty blonde color. So you might start to take some of those areas and just do color blocks. Don't think about texture in the hair or any of the striations of the hair. Just do color blocks. And she has some of those red tones, but they're like in the transitions, like here. And they're a little bit more honey colored. So maybe taking, you know, a little burnt sienna, but with ochre, mostly ochre, and maybe a touch of blue to gray it out. That might make a nice block-in color. These highlights are kind of a taupe ochre color, like that's like a gray ochre with white. So maybe a little ochre, a little bit of white, and a touch of blue should give you something like that. And that's going to make a big difference in the feeling of her skin tones as well. So yeah, don't go in and fuss too much with the skin tones on the major planes until you've finished painting in the features. So I'd finish blocking out her lips, her other eye, the skin tones, you know, this area, block out her shirt and her hair before you worry about going in and doing the glaze over the skin tones and adjusting these colors. Do that in your second pass. Okay? Do you have any specific questions? And I realize that there's a little less contrast in that shadow color that I had put in there. So you could push that just probably a little bit darker along that jawline, like right in here. So is the left eye okay? Yeah, let me take a closer look here. I think so. I kind of, the way I see the direction going, when you go back in with your second pass, you're probably going to go in and build more dark around the eye. And I would go in and put, since she has like a dark eyeliner on, you'll probably want to paint a little bit of that in as well. Just remember to leave some of that warmth for that underplane. We don't see actually much of the underplane on this side here. We sense a little more of the warmth on the right side. So you could glaze like a dark brown and blue kind of over this, and that you're going to start to build some of that contrast in her eye and a little bit underneath her eye as well. Just remember to leave that rim that you can see on the lower lid. We can definitely see that rim there I think you could build more contrast in this section. So when you go in and kind of mix, maybe make it a little bit more neutral, but I think you could work on pushing this darker in that second pass. But remember, don't go in and make edits to this eye until you've finished blocking out the other eye and you've done the second pass on the face. That would include this little segment in here, but I think that will help a lot. Just building that darker contrast in the eye. I think the shape looks pretty good. Make sure this isn't getting too kind of pointy. It has a little bit more of a roundness in that crease, so when you add that crease color a little bit, just make sure you round out a little bit at the top. Mostly like in this section here where that transitions. And you probably could lighten the whites of the eyes just a little bit on this side. Since our light is coming over from the right side, so from right to left, this white of the eye on the right side will be a little bit brighter. But you did a really nice job of keeping the whites of the eyes dark on the left side. So I would leave them a little bit as they are. Maybe if they're feeling a little red, you can kind of cool it off and make it a little bit more gray in that second pass. Be careful when you're blocking out the right eye here. It feels like it's starting to shrink just a little bit. So when you go in and paint this eye, just make sure, you know, that maybe open this up just a touch. I ended up doing that on my eyes when I went in and painted them because I noticed some things from my underpainting that needed to be changed, and also things had shifted just a little bit. So from my drawing, and I had noticed that not until the color stage, and sometimes that happens, so, and that's okay. Just maybe pay attention to how much space she has there. I'm just looking, make sure the iris doesn't shrink, and that will help a lot too. Okay, do you have any other questions? You're very welcome. I'm glad you found that helpful. It's, you know, this first pass is always a little shaky. Like we don't, you know, we're just kind of starting to establish the color relationships. Things can look kind of funky in its unfinished or half painted stage. So it's easy to get a little hard on ourselves about how our painting looks. But just remember, don't judge it until you get everything blocked in with that first color pass. Then we can start tweaking things and it's a lot easier. And take your time with that. All right, Susan, let me take a look and see who's next, and I'll try to get to you sooner. Okay, so Kathy, if you have any follow-up questions, just let me know, and I look forward to seeing your next layer. Thank you, Susan. Okay, so let me go ahead and work on yours over here. All right. So let's jump down real quick. And what specific questions do you have for this pass? You have a really nice block in here. I can't tell just due to the, you know, the glare from the lighting over here, but I assume that your background here is darker. So can you oil out every time colors have sunken in? It's best to just oil out the areas you're going to repaint into. Sometimes I will do a very small amount. If let's say I'm reworking like a section here, and I want to see how it relates to the shadow here, but my shadow is all sunk in, then I might oil out a little bit into the shadow and then wipe it off later. The point of oiling out is to bring back those true colors, but what can happen is if you oil out again and again and again, you build up and you haven't painted back into it with physical oil paint, it can build up these oily layers that can gather dust. They stay kind of gummy. They can yellow over time. I've even seen people who use excess oil. They'll come back to their painting years later and the painting weeps oil, meaning it like leaches out and ends up in these little spots all over the painting. It can be a bit of a nightmare. So oiling out is just so that you can see the true colors of the area you're planning to repaint. So I wouldn't oil out the whole face if I know I can only get to the forehead that day. And I talk a little bit about this when I go into repainting the second pass over the whole portrait. So listen to what I say in the new video and it'll explain a little bit about that too. Like here I can see very sunk in and very different from that color, even though chances are I think you have the same color there. Burnt sienna has a tendency to sink in a little bit more than some other colors, but what I like to do is my burnt sienna, it comes out really pasty out of the tube and it's really stiff, so I like to add a little bit of oil to my paint to loosen it up, and it also kind of gives it that gloss again, but it still sinks in on me, and that's due to the substrate too. If you're working on an acrylic primed canvas, those are much more absorbent than an oil primed canvas. So sometimes it's that porous substrate. Canvas tends to sink in more than panel, but that can depend on what kind of primer you've used or whatever primer was applied to it. Oleogel is a little better for oiling out only on, well, either one can work, but what you might find is if you're oiling out a segment, you might notice that the oil kind of beads up or has like little spots all over, kind of separates, and that can be due to a couple of different things. It can be surface tension, so like on panel it tends to happen because the panel is more slick. It could also be I noticed that with just lead white, it's a firmer paint film when it dries, and sometimes it can create like this glossy surface where the oil kind of does the same thing. It just beads up over the surface, and I like the Oleogel because it has that little bit of wax and silica in it, so it does not have that issue. And also you can put just such a thin amount and it does the job, whereas with oil it's a little harder to spread out without it kind of feeling like there's excessive oil. If you don't have Oleogel, you can also use Gamblin's solvent-free gel. That works great too. It's essentially very similar. You could also oil out using another medium like Neomeglip or Liquin, but the problem with using those is they have a quick dry time, so you might notice as you're trying to paint back into it that it's kind of gumming up on you and dragging your brush a little bit. It doesn't quite work as well. Those are great for glazing when you want the glaze to dry quickly, but they're not that ideal for oiling out in just like a general sense. Now you can use regular oil, and if you have an issue with the beading up, you can take cold wax and use that, or you can even, if it's a surface tension issue, you could take a very, very fine grit sandpaper. I know that sounds really scary, but you can take a very fine grit sandpaper and just lightly abrade the surface, and it will help break that surface tension a little bit and make the oiling out a little more smooth. But I don't like to do that because, you know, taking a sandpaper to your painting can be a little scary. So I would suggest going with a solvent-free gel like the Gamblin solvent-free gel or the Oleogel. And remember, you're just applying a very small amount. You're just spreading it out super thin. And one thing that actually works great for oiling out, I just didn't have any when I was filming this part of the course, was using a makeup sponge, a latex makeup sponge. Even when you're using oil to oil out, try using a makeup sponge because it tends to apply less and you can kind of rub off, and it also kind of absorbs some of the oil so you can wipe it dry with that, and it won't leave any hairs or fuzzy, you know, pieces from the paper towel behind. Okay, so let me go ahead and talk a little bit about your painting here. She does feel overall warmer than our model. So, but you do have a nice block in. So what I would suggest is once you allow this layer to dry and you want to go into your second pass, focus on adding cool tones to the skin. So a lot of what I did was I added warm tones because mine started off very cool. But areas like in here on her cheek, right now you have a very kind of warm peachy tone that's something like that, and she has a little bit more of a gray. So you're pretty close to the right value. You're probably a little bit light, but I would take this color that you have there and gray it down. So take a little bit of blue to it. And if you do that, it's going to help turn that form down. Remember that this section here is the cool zone of the face, with the exception of the lips. Here we have the warm zone, and here we kind of have a neutral zone. And that has to do with the flesh, and we do have another little warm zone down here in the chin. But overall, through the jaw area, you should have more of a cool tone. And that's going to help a lot. So if you, before you do that, I would definitely oil out this area here so that it comes back to the true color. I do feel like in the drawing, there's a few things that shifted in her lips. They feel maybe a touch wide, and it's not so much where you have the corner of the mouth, because it seems pretty close to where hers sits in relationship to the eye. But I think it's where you have this coming all the way to the corner and this coming all the way to the corner, the pink of the lips. So you'll notice that the pink portion of the lip ends first. Let me grab a pen here so I can be more specific. So you'll notice that this curves down and then it's a shadow shape. And yours kind of just arcs straight to that corner. And so it makes the lips seem a little wider than they are. Same goes for the bottom lip. This really just kind of fades off. It doesn't come all the way to the corner there. So pay attention to that when you shift into your drawing, and don't remember to place this more in a shadow range on that side. Right now the value all the way across the bottom or the top lip feels very similar, whereas here we can see very specific segments that are in the darker range, and then she has these little light zones. But even this light zone here, let's do a color comparison. This light zone is somewhere around that value, right? And then this light zone is around that value. So there is a distinction, and that's going to give you the sense of that plane change and the volume of the lip as the form wraps across the ball. Remember that ball form that's here. It's kind of spherical, so there's going to be stronger light on the left side, more shadow on the right side. So pay attention to that, and go back and revisit the planes video on the lips if you need to. But what I would suggest first is concentrating on your light planes in the major planes before you go back in and worry about something like that. So if you go in and add more of these cool gray tones into the lower part of the face, especially as you get down, don't be afraid to add a little bit more of a dark gray right where it meets the shadow, because it feels maybe a touch light just where that little overlap is. I'm going to just carry this color over because I know that should be close to the color under here. Once you oil it out, if it's not matching, then you need to kind of repaint that section, but that should be good. And then over here, it goes a lot darker. It's in the same kind of color zone as this gray here, but it's a darker range, and I think you could push that just a little bit more in those little segments here and right along that shadow edge below the warm cheek zone. Right in there. So don't be afraid to push that. Her chin should have a warm zone right here, but as it moves over, it should start to cool off. So you can see that this takes on more of a cool gray up in this section as well. And it should be maybe a little darker as it wraps over towards the right. You can see it has these a little bit more of that spherical form there. So no, don't correct the mouth before you do the second pass. You can easily do that when you go in and paint the lips. And when I went in for my second pass, I avoided this area and the eyes, and I pretty much painted all of this section instead. And I left the muzzle and the lips alone. So I'm going to go in, that is part of the features. I did go in and paint all the cheek and the chin. I pretty much painted the whole large plane section. So adding those cool colors is going to make a difference, and look for areas like in here where it needs to cool as well as it transitions to that shadow. So instead of getting warmer in this section, it should get more gray. I think you have enough gray in the forehead, but it feels a little light. So maybe just remember to push it a little darker when you go back in and revisit that second pass for the planes in the shadow, or on the large planes. And I even repainted a little bit of the edge of my shadow when I did mine, as you'll see in the video here. So you're asking, is there a substitute for burnt sienna? It won't behave the same way. So burnt sienna, if you take a bunch of earth reds that are out there, there's English red, there's Indian red, burnt sienna, even transparent oxide red, even though that one's more transparent. The burnt sienna is kind of the most neutral of all of them. Indian yellow or Indian red tends to go very violet. English red goes very pink, and burnt sienna kind of has that middle orange pink kind of neutrality. And then if you looked at like transparent red oxide, when you mix them with white, it tends to go very, very yellow compared to the burnt sienna. And it's great to just as a test do this for yourself and mix the different reds that you have with just straight white and just see how they tint differently. To help fight the burnt sienna creating that sunk in, you can get around using burnt sienna too if you make a color like mixing. It's going to take a little bit more work. So you could take cadmium red, yellow ochre, and blue, mix those together, and you can get a color very similar to what burnt sienna does. And it won't tend to sink in as much, but it just takes a lot more work to balance out those three colors. But you can try it and see if you come up with a color that behaves very similar. It might still sink in. It just depends on, the substrate as well. Okay, so yeah, that looks really good. I think just concentrate on those cool tones. You'll see I go in and add more blues and enhance blues around the eyes. So just pay attention to a couple of those areas. And then make sure you do go in and start to build a little bit more brightness in a few of these areas here. That cooler light tone. Start to pop some of those colors. Not that you're putting on the brightest highlights just yet, but you're just building up the luminosity with each gradual layer. Actually, no, I don't think her nose is, well, are you talking about in this shadow, the deepest shadow? Then her nose should be probably a little bit darker. Maybe like right through here, you could glaze that down just a little bit. But I do feel like you actually need to lighten up a little bit of the tip of her nose, like right through this section here. I had added some there. So you can see that if you go in and lighten that up a little bit, that will help too. Okay, so do you have any other questions? You have a really solid block in. I think we're focusing on those cool tones is going to help, and I would do that first before you address the mouth and the eyes. The video on doing the second pass on the eyes and the mouth is going to come kind of middle of the week again, because we're lumping the weeks 6 and 7 together because there's a lot of work for you guys to do. And so I don't want you to feel rushed for our next critique. So just take your time, and next week I think what we'll probably do is just play it as a catch-up week. So for those of you who feel like you're a little behind, you haven't had a chance to block in your features, then you can just focus on that this week, and then in times for critique. I wasn't planning for us to have a critique next weekend, but we'll go ahead and do that. And I'll send an email out to everyone with details on what you want to focus on this week instead. All right, Susan, good job, and let me know if any questions pop up and as you kind of develop the next layer of your painting. I'm just going to leave that one there so I know I already edited it. Okay, so let's go to Suzanne. I don't know if you're in here, Suzanne. I did have a few questions for you if you're in here. I felt like the photograph looked a little bit warmer. It looks like I can kind of see up here with the glare that there's this warm light. So I'm going to just play with the curves a little bit. And the color balance here. I'm going to take a little bit of that yellow away. Ooh. That looks a little bit more balanced. So I'm gonna, like I said earlier, I'll do a little video on the best lighting and how to set up for photographing your work in kind of an ideal situation. So I'll do a couple of a little short tutorial video on, even if you don't have a nice professional lighting setup, like things you can do to help you photograph your work. I know sometimes it's just easier to see it done rather than read about it or see it explained. Okay, so my suggestion here is, first off, it would be good to block out the features before you go in and address any of these skin tones. I think whenever we see lips that are pale, that don't have a lot of color in them, it can really influence the whole portrait. So if you didn't get around to painting in your features, again, don't judge your skin tones until you've got those features painted in. So I would go through and definitely paint in the eyes and get those nice warm hues around the eyes next, and then of course the lips. And I'll show you what a difference that can make here just real quick. If you look here, just adding a little pink, a little deep red, that's a real loose block in, but you can see how big of a difference that makes in terms of the feeling of the portrait. So when it comes to judging all of your other colors, you can't really do much until you've blocked in some of those areas. Overall, your colors feel like they're on the way there. I can't quite tell because of the yellow light if they're feeling a little warm. I do feel like this looks a little yellow, but it could just be that warm light, and if that's the case, then I would just leave it and try to photograph it under a little bit more of a neutral or cool light. One thing I would suggest is when you go back into your second pass is to concentrate on smoothing out some of these transitions along the shadow edge. The shadow edge feels a little sudden, and I think if you reworked some of this edge here to be a little bit softer, especially where this red comes out here, you have this like deep burgundy that just rides that shadow edge a little bit. It's going to help turn that form more gradually. And then same goes for down here, having some of these deeper cool tones just right next to the shadow edge is going to create a little bit more of that rounding of the form. And I found that when I was repainting these areas, I had to go in and just retile just a little bit of the brown for my shadow so that I had something to blend that lighter halftone into. Even along the edge of the nose, you want to watch having any real hard shadow, even though through the bridge of the nose we do have a little bit more of a firm edge. I can't tell if this is still part of the underpainting or if that's in color, but just make sure you have a softer transition tone there along the bridge of the nose, especially in this spot right here. So I would just make sure you go in and have a few of those extra halftones. If you guys had issues with blending, or if, for example, the blending, you can still see some sudden tiles, what I would do is in that second pass, you can find colors that are in between, or if you see a different color in that area, then you can start to scumble very thin amounts of paint just over those transition zones and smooth out those edges. It's often hard to do in that first pass if you're not used to the technique, so don't worry if you're finding that it has a little bit of a rough transition in an area. It's very, very easy to change in that second pass. Like for example, right in here where this jumps over, I would just take a little bit of the lighter color and just very thinly scumble, over those areas, and it would help to smooth out those transitions. I'm just looking at a couple of other areas. I do feel like if you go back into the nose, I would want to see maybe more of a red, especially on this left nostril where you have this light kind of bouncing in here. So don't be afraid to really pump up the chroma when you get into those areas. It looks like it's still part of the underpainting, but it's a little hard to tell. Now, not in the first color pass, we didn't worry too much about reflected lights, and we're not going to worry about it in the second color pass either. We're going to get our lights kind of solidified before we go back in, but I do feel like parts of that shadow shape need to adjust just a tiny bit. I think her chin feels a little long by just a small amount. So when you go in with that second pass, maybe go in and raise that shadow edge up just a tiny bit. Not that dark of a color though. Let's keep it into the lighter zone. But I think something like that, and then bring it up here through this segment where it kind of dances up, just so it has more variety to the shape. But that's going to lock in her likeness a little bit more accurately and shorten her jaw area through here. Okay, so I think those are my only suggestions. Actually, her neck feels a little short through here. I would just bring that down just a little bit lower. Other than that, that looks pretty good. So if you have any follow-up questions, just reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing the painting develop. You have a great start here, so just get those features blocked in, and then you can take a second look at that second color pass across the features, or sorry, the large planes. All right, very nice. All right, Angela. Are you here, Angela? All right, so I wanted to ask you, if you were in here, if this feels a little bit blown out. Did I bring in another picture? I thought I did, but yeah, so the picture here, it's a little hard for me to judge the color. So if you can get a better picture, I can do a different paint over outside of this critique, but I feel like with this, I can tell by the kind of the hotness of that value is that that the picture itself is kind of blown out. So I can't see very accurately what your colors are. And like I said in that tutorial, I'll talk about how to adjust the exposure on your camera, and I'll even show you how to do it with your phone. It's very easy. That way you can use either your phone or a regular camera to capture a good picture. Overall, I do feel like it's a little yellow and hot, but again, I think a lot of that has to do with the exposure. Now I can try to bring this down a bit, but the problem with photography is if it's overexposed, it's not going to have any information in those areas. No matter how much I bring it down, it's not going to give me those areas because the camera wasn't able to pick it up. So I'll just bring down some of the midtones for the background, and I think I'll take out some of the yellow. But I'm not going to, I think what I would like you to focus on is to finish blocking out the features. And we can go over your painting in depth next week with a better picture. I know it's tricky to photograph. It's one of my things I hate doing is photographing my work because it's always really, really tricky. But oops, here I meant to do that one. But I would concentrate on blocking out the color in the other features. It looks like you had a chance to go into this eye here, and it looks really nice. So I would go ahead and finish out these areas, and then take a second look at your skin tones. If this looks pretty close to how it does feel in life, my suggestion is that the light colors, the highlight areas, are too yellow, and that they need to be a little bit more of a cool pink. But like I said, I would concentrate on getting those features blocked in, and then we'll do a kind of a mid critique next week. You don't have to have the full second color pass done, but just get your painting kind of up to speed. I know it was a lot of work, so not everyone feels like they're caught up. So I'm going to give everyone kind of an extra critique next week, or at our usual time on Saturday, so that you can get caught up with the features and tweak a few things if you want to, before we kind of move forward with the detail layers. I think that'll make a big difference is to block in the pinks. This color here feels a little hot. Again, if this doesn't represent your painting in person, then you might ignore what I'm saying here. But based on the picture, you can see it's much more of like a cool pink, more of a mauve tone. So all that suggests is that you need to add a little bit of blue to this color here. So add blue, and probably maybe a little bit of alizarin, and it will help cool that color, especially as it rounds to that shadow. Okay, so if you have any follow-up questions or you want to send me a better photograph for me to look at this stage before you move on with the features, then try sending another email to me real quick, and I'll send you back a different paint over if I see something. And then watch that video that I'll release later this week on how to photograph your work under the best lighting and that sort of thing. That way I can see more accurately some of the colors. All right, Susan, thank you for letting Susan go first. Let's go ahead and, I know you said you didn't quite get to finishing blocking out the planes, so don't, like I said, don't rush this stage. I think I had written you. I want you to take your time with this stage, so work on it throughout the week. And next week we'll do, you can even just concentrate on the big planes. This week, if you can't get to the features, it's better to spend as much time as possible on this first pass. So just finish blocking out, you know, the lower feature or the lower large planes, and get the features done if you can. And if you want help kind of midweek, just send me a in progress shot. If you finish out the large planes but you want to move on to the features, you can, but just don't rush this stage and don't worry about doing the second pass just yet. We won't do a critique on the second color pass until week 7. Okay, so this coming up week, well, no, sorry. This is week 6. Let me look at the schedule. I'm getting confused on the schedule, so I will send everyone kind of an updated schedule here this afternoon, just adjusting mostly what you guys need to be doing. I think we didn't have I think 7 and 8, 6 and 7, 7 and 8. I can't remember exactly. I will get clear on that and let everyone know exactly what to focus on for our mid critique next week. Your drawing looks really good. I think you've really captured a good likeness. When you move into color, you're going to start to feel like you can tweak that likeness a little bit further. It's kind of hard to do in the grisaille stage, and drawing does change a little bit. And you'll notice, like, I don't know if you've watched the video where I painted the mouth, but I had a lot of changes to make there. And I talked about adjusting some of the underpainting or, you know, changing from the underpainting if you have changes to do in the color stage. Though, you know, there's one thing I'm sensing just a little bit to keep in mind when you go in and block in. This distance here feels a little bit narrow. Let me highlight it in a different color. So like here to here feels narrower than her face. She has a little bit more of a wide roundness in this section. So just when you go in to paint your color, maybe push the reflected light out just a touch wider. Not by very much, but I think that'll help lock in her likeness a little bit more too. Because we don't want to narrow this space too much by pushing that shadow wider, but it just felt a little narrow. So maybe do that when you go down into the lower part of the cheek and you start blocking in the shadow with a more solid color. Yeah, it is hard to see in that reference. Remember, you can always lighten the reference just to try and see into the shadows, even if you blow out the lights. Just make a duplicate copy of the file, and then really, really lighten it up. I have a picture of painting I'm working on right now where almost all of the shadow, my camera hardly captured anything. I can kind of see some of the forms, but it's really, really hard. So I have 2 versions of that picture, and I made one really, really blown out so that I could start to see at least where the drawing like of the ear should be and that sort of thing. And sometimes that's just necessary, even though it's not going to be painted in that bright, just for you to be able to see where it is. So yeah, I think you have a really great start. Your colors across the forehead seem pretty good, but I do sense that they're a little warm. But that's also based on this color, and it looks like it could be a little light. But is this photo looking a little light of your painting? Because I can try adjusting a little bit. Bring down maybe the average mid-tone here a little bit. And maybe take out some of that yellow. I'm just playing with the color here just to see. That seems a little closer. So I'm just basing it on the background color here in this upper right corner. It's a little hard to tell because that's looking a little greenish now. But I'm just playing around with that. Okay, well, what I would suggest is I don't really want to say much about your color at this stage just because you don't have the rest of it blocked in, and it will be really hard for me to judge the colors across here. Your forms look great. Your transitions look good. So I would just continue blocking this out, and we'll go over it more in depth next week. Concentrate on those big planes. And if you feel like, I kind of sense that this is maybe still having some of that warmth come through from the underpainting. So you might try introducing more of a kind of a cooler blue-gray purple to kind of scumble over some of this section, because that's going to help change some of the feeling in the portrait as well. And of course, make sure you cover these hot areas with the color as needed, just to make sure that, you know, when we go in and make adjustments to your portrait, or I critique it for that second color pass, that I can see all the colors as they will relate to one another. Yeah, I'll have some tips on how to you know, adjust and different types of lighting to try out for capturing your portrait. Sometimes the light we paint under doesn't always translate with the camera, although you can play with camera settings, but I still find that sometimes the white balance settings on cameras doesn't quite match, you know, the type of lighting. Like you can change it to incandescent or fluorescent lighting, but sometimes it over exaggerates a little bit. So I'll talk about how to do that on a DSLR, and also how to just adjust a little bit on your phone, which is a little more limited, but there's some apps out there that are pretty decent for adjusting color. Oh, okay, so tungsten, yeah, that's definitely like the reason it's so warm. Yeah, that's okay. Don't worry about that for now. Just finish blocking it out, and maybe if you don't have more of a cool fluorescent or CFL light, then you could take it just out that you're painting into the next to a window that's like a north-facing window, or even if it's not north-facing, if you have just a window where no direct light is coming through, but it's indirect light, that can often be the best for photographing. That's okay. Cell phone, I photograph with my cell phone all the time. The cameras are pretty good on them. It's just they don't have as many options just built into, I have an iPhone, but just built into the program, the regular camera program. But there are some really decent apps out there that let you change white balance a little bit more in depth while you're taking the picture. And it just gives you a little more flexibility for photographing. I know phones are just more convenient for pulling out and snapping a picture. But I'll show both. I'll show how to play with both and get a decent shot for our critiques. Because from here forward, it's going to be kind of important to get a good picture so that I can see more accurately what you're seeing in person. I wish I could be there in person with all of you and, you know, talk to you about your painting in person, but we are miles and miles apart, so we'll have to make do and do our best to kind of compromise. All right, and do you have any questions, Susan? Okay, good. All right. Well, if any questions pop up as you're working on your planes on your first color pass, just let me know. All right, Beth. Are you in here, Beth? Okay, so I just wanted to ask you a few questions about your painting, because it looks like some areas of the background are sunk in and some are kind of glossy. My overall feeling is that the background took on a little bit more of a cool tone which can kind of alter the feeling of the skin tones. However, I think you have a great start to your skin tones here. I just can't tell if the picture feels too light to you or if I should try to go in and darken it a little bit compared to how your painting feels in person. Apart from the sunken areas, of course. But maybe bringing the exposure down just a touch. Does that feel a little bit better in terms of lightness? The background very dark in person. Okay, yeah, I can kind of sense that here in the left side there and in the lower right here. But I'm going to concentrate on the skin tones, so you let me know how they're feeling. Maybe too cool. Okay, let me adjust some of the color balance here. So maybe a little bit more red, maybe a little more yellow, just a touch. How does that look to you? Yep, okay. All right, so let's go from here, and your shirt is more turquoise. That could have to do with the yellow setting. Let's see. Yeah, without changing the whole thing, I can't quite change the shirt, but I'll keep that in mind as far as the shirt goes. Okay, so yeah, you have a nice start with your color. I think you're capturing a pretty good feeling of her skin tones. The only thing I think maybe could cool off, and it's a little hard to tell if the photo's blown out or if it's like influence of the lighting that you were photographing under, but the lights here feel maybe a little yellow, whereas she has more of like a pink tint there. So if we just took a quick sample of each one, you're really, really close. You're just a little bit more kind of yellow-gray. So maybe as you move into your second pass after you're finished with the features block in, just remember you might have to scumble more of a pink in certain areas, and that will help balance it out a little bit. I think what you should probably concentrate on this week is finishing blocking out the features, you know, the eyes, the nose, and the lips. It's going to take some time, so just spend as much time as you need on it this week, and we'll do our mid-critique next weekend. Don't worry about doing that second color pass just yet if you can't get to it. I'd rather you concentrate your time on getting those features blocked in nicely. One thing to keep in mind as you move forward is I'm noticing that the nose on the left side feels a little bit wide. So just make sure when you go in and start to paint the nose that you pay attention to where the width of the nostril sits compared to the eye. It almost is just inside of her tear duct here, that wing of the nostril. So I think the opening of the nostril kind of can come in, and then this can be the widest point to her nostril there. Let me do this on another layer though. So yeah, I think moving that nostril in a little bit and maybe having the width there, that will help. It's not a huge difference, but it will add up, you know, when you're going into that color layer. And I would say on the right side of the mouth, just extend this shadow a little bit when you go into the mouth. I would just make that a little bit wider than what you have. You're plenty wide on the left side for the lips. I think you're pretty good there. And when it comes to this eye here, I would just open up, when you go in and paint it in, I had to open up mine too a little bit because I noticed it got small. Just open up that arc over the pupil area because you can see how rounded you have this, and then this one's a little more squished. So just open that up a little bit. It'll be easier to do in color. You can do it in the underpainting color, but if you prefer, and then let that dry and then go back into the features, or you can just do it when you jump into the color stage. The chin also looks too prominent. It could be that you've exaggerated that shape. Her chin is more narrow. Let's take a look here. So that dip is kind of lined up with the corner of the mouth there. And then this kind of comes up like at a slant there. So it could be, so my feeling is that that point needs to move over to the left just a little bit, which will help shorten this distance. It looks like that's pretty good, but maybe bring the shadow here a little higher so it doesn't dip down so quickly. And then that shape can probably stay the same. But this one is going to come up kind of sooner. So you might change your shadow shape to come kind of up at an angle like that. And then join in with the shadow there. Yes, I can send you an email with the drawing changes. I'll be sending everyone with the paint overs, and I'll send you this one here with just the drawing changes. Okay, so that should do it for the chin. I think that'll help make it less prominent. Let me do a quick paint over and just see if that helps. Sometimes seeing the shapes not just in line, but in value can help a lot. And also softer edges, if you kind of create some more halftones in these lower portions, that can make a big difference as well in how hard that chin kind of feels like it juts out. Someone with like a really prominent chin that maybe juts out a little bit further in profile, they're going to have a harder kind of line there and a harder highlight and shadow edge, but she's very rounded and soft. So by putting in more, halftone transitions before that lighter value, and you can almost see that this side here is a little darker than what you have, and there's more of this halftone kind of coming up over this form. That's going to help shrink the illusion of the chin quite a bit. And building up those gradual transitions like down in here. I think you might actually be okay in that value range that you have. Just maybe having another transition tone in the chin area before it gets too light. Okay, so yeah, I would say maybe your color here feels a little hot and maybe a little light for transitioning into that shadow. So when you do approach your second pass, you can always just go in a little darker. I do that in mine, so watch that video first because I think that will help you. But again, concentrate on the features, and if that takes you all week, that's okay, because I don't expect a second color pass until the critique after next week. So I'm giving you guys just a little bit extra time through these first two color passes because they take a lot of time to do, and I don't want you to rush through the features because it took me hours to do the features and it's probably going to take you guys longer since it's the first time you've done this process. So really don't rush through it. The background, I think it feels a little blue, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you want to add some more variety to it, maybe take a little bit more, let's see, if you took the shadow color or the color that you have for the background, I would a touch of cadmium red to it, maybe just a tiny bit, and it will help turn it into more of this kind of burgundy color. You can keep the background any color you want. You can keep it really dark if you want. I'm not too concerned about that. Just make sure that whatever color you do choose for the background is going to reflect into those halftones, especially where any of the forms turn towards the background. So these points here, you know, anywhere along the edge. The green kind of influences this side a little bit more. You can definitely see it in her throat here. It's reflecting this background color. So maybe pay attention to that as well. If you want to change the background color, just take the color that you have and add a touch of cadmium red to it, and see if that helps. And you don't even have to apply it evenly over the whole background. You can just scumble it. I'm going to be repainting my background, but not until later. I'm going to have a whole video on adjusting the background. So if it bothers you now, you can just do a very rough scumble over the background color, just to warm it up in a few areas and allow some of that cooler tone to pop through. Or you can leave it until a little bit later. And you might find like that this blue feels different when you change the background color too. So, but those are things that we're going to get into in the next few refinement layers. I'm going to go over how to paint fabric. We're going to talk about even painting jewelry and hair, and those are all going to be kind of their own videos in the coming weeks. So the bulk of the work is during this week when we get our block in, our first color pass, and then each layer is just refining and refining and refining. And there's going to be less and less work for you guys to do as time goes on. So if you need more work, you know, you need to extend your work time for these passes, then by all means do so. That way, you know, your work that you have to repaint, you know, later on, it's not as much work for you to do. You know, the more time you spend on this, the less repainting and correcting you have to do later. Yeah, the background is more of a dark purple. I feel like you do have a dark purple. It's just more of a blue violet. And her background is maybe more of a red violet, and there's maybe a little more opacity to it. It has a little bit more of a red, warm violet to it. And maybe it looks like you might have used a little alizarin. So sometimes adding cadmium red light, because it's more of a red orange. And if that still feels too purple, you can dull any kind of violet color by adding its complement, which is yellow. So throw in some yellow ochre, and that might help as well. Okay? Do you have any questions? So just to recap, focus on getting those features blocked in this week, and I'd make some of those drawing adjustments. Okay, perfect. All right. If you have any other questions, just let me know. And I see some people popping in here. Hi, Randy. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on here. So Kelly, I don't know if you're in here live, but I'm going to make some adjustments to your picture because it looks very, very warm in the photograph. And it looks a little light due to some of the glare of the light from above. So I'm going to just play with this a little bit and then cool off some of those tones because I can tell that yellow light. There you are. Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it, Kelly. If so you sent me one with the features like the lips and the other ones blocked in. I don't know if it's a different picture from this one. But let me know if this picture feels a little bit warm. My feeling is that it feels a little bit yellow, and I'm trying to take out some of that, just a touch, to balance out the photograph of your painting here. Oh, this is the one you sent me. Okay, good, good. Okay, so I'm working from the right one. How does the color feel compared to the painting, or to the, yeah, to the painting in life? Does this look a little bit more balanced? Maybe the shadows need to be a little more warm, but the midtones need to be a little less yellow. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go with that, but if it looks off from your painting, just let me know how I should adjust it. Okay, so that looks a little bit more balanced to me though. All right, so I think you did a nice job with your first color pass. A couple of things just to note before you go into your second one. This eye here, oops, let me grab my pen. So this eye here, I think you just need to clarify the drawing a little bit. I can tell that this eye is looking up in this direction, but this one looks like it's kind of looking over in this direction. So what that would have to do with is opening up the eye in that arc and making sure that that curve isn't so round. Like right now it's kind of rounding down. But if an eye is looking up, then the curve is kind of more segmented up here, and then the pupil is going to move up a little bit. Your position is probably pretty close, but I think it's just a matter of moving that pupil up a little bit and adjusting that curve so that she's looking in the same direction with both eyes. So work on that when you go into your second pass on the eyes. But if those areas are still wet, I want you to concentrate on doing a second pass over the features, or sorry, over the large planes. My feeling is that the lighting could be a little warm in some areas, some of the colors. So you might try focusing on adding more cool tones and enhancing some of the cool tones in your second color pass. So a good example would be down here. You have kind of more of a purple tint here, but it maybe go more blue-gray. And you'll see if you watch my video on the second color pass, I actually do that in mine as well. I enhance some of that blue-gray feeling down in here. So you might take a look at that first before you go over your second pass. And you can see that that already helped to cool off that zone. And then same thing down in here. Just pay attention to those really cool gray zones, and maybe a little bit darker on these sections where it meets the shadow edge. It'll create a more subtle transition in those areas. I know there's other areas in there that are a little lighter, and you can build those into that a little bit later. You know, like she has this little light pass here and a little bit here. But I think the key is to start moving it away from this kind of brown zone and really start pushing some of those cool tones. That way the pinks and the reds pop out a little bit more. Same thing here, just next to that shadow. It does have a lot of pink in her forehead, but right next to that shadow it starts to get much more gray, like right in through there. And maybe work on deepening that transition. So you had a question. The color of your painting should be lighter in person, but not that pink. Okay, all right, let me adjust that real quick. So maybe a little less pink. And then a little bit lighter. Probably the midtones seem pretty good, but maybe it's a little lighter. Just a touch over here. Okay, well, we'll go with that for now. Your value structure seems pretty good. You have that nice fall off of light across the form, you know, kind of coming in this direction here. So you have your brightest highlight here, and it's getting darker as it comes down. But just make sure you start to take into account those cool tones. I think that's going to make a big difference here. And then, of course, smoothing out some of these transitions. And the second color pass is really about finding some of those nuances that were too hard to kind of get in that first color pass. And sometimes I go through and I repaint entire segments, but with very thin color. And all I'm doing is either smoothing out a transition, or I'm changing the temperature, or I'm adding an accent color somewhere to help my other colors enhance. So for example, in here, adding like a cooler tone can help enhance that warm highlight. And her highlight might feel a little yellow, and I can't tell if that's the photo, but I feel like maybe, well, it's okay to have some yellow in the highlight. You want some, maybe an adjacent cool color that's of a similar value, and that will help it feel brighter and vibrate a little bit more, and it'll feel a little bit more like her skin tone. I think her nose needs a little more pink. It feels a little brown, so I would go in and just find where you can enhance with a little bit of a pink and maybe a red in the nostrils. Especially that tip of the nose. You can, when you look in these areas, there's these little hot zones of color, like right, oops, go back to my ink pen. Okay, so like right in here, right before that form turns up, you have that red kind of accent. It warms up and you have a lot more red right in here. So even those little touches can make a difference. But going in and making it a little more pink around the highlight can also help quite a bit. And her lips, maybe a cooler pink in her lips, and just pump up the chroma in those areas. That way they feel not in the same color zone as the features. Okay? Do you have any other questions? Let me go back to that color here, and I'll just show you, like, if you enhance that berry kind of cool pink in her lips, and you really pump up the saturation for that pink shadow on her lips, it's just going to add more color variety. That's a very loose version of what's happening. She has a lot more colors kind of happening in here and in here, but you can see just adding that is adding some variety to her skin tones. The shadow of the nose, it should take on a little bit more of a gray in this plane here. So maybe just a little bit lighter right in here. But I think a big part of that is getting those deep, rich reds for the nostrils. So that mixture I talked about with using alizarin with an enhanced red, like a red oxide or even a touch of cadmium, can do wonders for areas like this where it's really, really dark, but we want to add more life to that shadow. And it could be that these colors are kind of sunk in right now and I can't quite see that you have that red in there, but just pay attention to it when you go in to repaint it. Oil out, and remember not to make this philtrum too dark. She doesn't really have a shadow there, it's just a slightly darker value, and it's a little cooler temperature. And her muzzle area is going to get lighter anyway, so just make sure you don't have that too bright. And she also has a little bit of light that kind of creeps in under here and changes that shape just a touch. The light doesn't go that high, it just kind of comes in on that little plane there. And a little bit here. So yeah, concentrate on those larger planes though first when you go in for your second pass, and take your time. If you want feedback next weekend, feel free to send it, but take your time with that first or that second color pass, because we won't do much of a critique on that until the following weekend after. Do you have any other questions? Yeah, the nose is a kind of a small shape, and it's easy to kind of lose the drawing. So get out those small brushes, and you'll see in that second color pass video the size brushes and the type of brushes I use that will help with that. All right, nice work. All right, so Linda, are you here, Linda? Make this reference a little bigger here. All right, so I had a few questions, Linda, for you. Oh, good. Oh, good, you're here. Different name on your username. Okay, I just wanted to ask you, does this picture feel a little more yellow than your painting feels in real life? And maybe a little bit light? So I would like to get it as close as possible. Here, let me switch to that layer. So I'm gonna, oops, cancel. Okay, so let me just try and take out, yes, it's more yellow and you have darker shadows. Okay, so let me take out some of that yellow here. Does that feel better? Let me go back to the curves and maybe bring the shadows a little bit deeper. Keep selecting that recolor setting. And then your shadows, they feel a little red, and I would venture to say that they maybe aren't quite that red. Take out some of the yellow in those shadows too. Does that look a little better? Yours is not that cool? Okay. How does this look right now? With the color balance. Do I need to warm up the lights a little bit? More yellow or pink? Your shadows are more gray. Yeah, I don't know how well it's gonna let me try without changing the background. Yeah, it's not gonna let me do that much adjustment here. All right, well, let's kind of ignore those shadows for now. Maybe I'll take out some of the magenta. There we go. Let's try that for now. It's okay on the lights. Okay, good. All right, so we're at a happy middle. I think I can kind of work with this here, and I'll just keep in mind that your shadows are maybe less red. Okay, I think you have a really nice first color pass. I think it's going to make a big difference when you add in the pinks for the lips and the pinks in the eyes. So I would suggest you move forward on that this week. My only suggestion moving forward is as we approach that second color pass is to concentrate on maybe a little more of a cool gray in this lower part of the face. And you'll see me do that in my portrait for the demo as well. So I'm just enhancing that and then working out some of the transition tones, maybe a little more smooth. She has a little hint of pink here, and I go in my painting and add a little more of that as well, because mine didn't quite have that warmth. So she has like just this rosiness that kind of comes in here, and your forehead feels maybe just a little more yellow. So I think you can balance out some of that by throwing in some of these cooler pinks to kind of interrupt that yellow when you go into that second color pass. But don't rush to that stage. I would concentrate on getting your features blocked in because that can change the feeling of the portrait drastically. So get the eyes, nose, and lips blocked in before you, worry about adjusting or making subtle changes to those larger planes. Value-wise, I do feel like you maybe will want to go back when you go in with that second pass, though. You might want to create a darker kind of cool red, like a berry red, to transition this edge here just a little bit in that shadow as it moves down into the cheek. It's mostly just that edge got a little bit hard. When you move into the lips, just a few notes on the width of her mouth. It feels like it got a little bit narrow through here. So just make sure you're paying attention to how wide her mouth, those corners. Now her lips end a little bit sooner, but the corners of her mouth are just a little bit wider. This one might be okay compared to the eye. It could be that this arc is too far to the left. So I'd say her little Cupid's bow should be around there. And then that's kind of her lip shape there. But this right side could definitely come out maybe by about that much. And that's a pretty easy shape to extend here. So just extend that and you're going to capture her lips a little bit closer. The height of the lips seems pretty good if this is your line there. It's a little hard to tell just because you have a second value, darker value there, but I think that your main line is somewhere in there. Make sure when you go in tiling in the nose too that you allow for plenty of transitions here. She has kind of this double shadow shape. Let me choose white so it's easier to see. So you have like this shadow, then you have the cast shadow, kind of that's darker, and then she has this other like kind of half shadow shape. It's slightly lighter, but it's still considered part of the shadow, but just make sure you do define that a little bit when you move into the nose shape here. And her nostril might have gotten a little low. I'm just looking, yeah. So just make sure that this kind of comes in and that maybe that's a little bit higher. And then you have that shadow shape, and then this shadow shape kind of coming in this way, and then there's this little halftone. So those are my main suggestions. This eye feels maybe a little open here. Just maybe square that off a little bit so it matches this eye here on the right when you go in with your color pass. It's very subtle, but the top of the eye seems pretty good. You just might need to just bring that up a little more flat. And yeah, concentrating on those cool tones in your second color pass. But focus on those features first, and then we'll kind of readdress the second color pass after I've seen your features blocked in next week. And then we'll talk about more details on how you can refine some of these transitions in the following week after. Okay, do you have any questions, Linda? Oh, good, you're already starting one eye. Yeah, and remember to look for those really enhanced kind of pinks. She really has them in here. Part of it is her makeup, but you can really see some of these zones in here. Like right in here, there's this pickup of that pink chroma kind of hiding behind the eyelashes. They're not quite shadows, but they're pretty dark, but they're very rich. And then she has more enhanced pink in here, and especially that red undertone there. That's going to come in handy. And as soon as you start to add those, the portraits really start to come to life. So yeah, we'll take another look at it. Alrighty, good work. If you have any other questions during the week, then just let me know. And so everyone who tuned in today, for our critique session next week, it's going to be kind of a half critiques because some of you are catching up. So those of you who have not blocked in your features, watch the rest of the features video. The second one, if you haven't watched it already, where I block in the right eye and the lips. That one was put up a couple of days ago, so watch that and then finish out your features. Take your time with it, so just spend the whole week doing that. And it's not a hard deadline, so if you can't quite get them all finished, it's okay. Just take your time and do them well. And next week we'll critique on those. If you already blocked out your features and you are kind of wanting to move into that second color pass, that's okay. You don't need to turn anything in next week unless you just want some midweek kind of brief feedback. Just take your time doing that second color pass, and we'll have a formal critique the week after. And I will email everyone kind of the details of this this afternoon, so that way you can kind of see the adjustments to the schedule. I'm sure everyone's going to appreciate having just a little extra time to work on this first color pass. I know it's a lot of work, and you know, you don't really want to rush yourself through this. So, does anyone have any final questions? And I will send everyone your your paint overs. I'll try and get yours to you by after my other critique by 5 o'clock. So you should be able to get some of the details of those by then. All right, everyone. So if there's no further questions, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the forum. Oh, Kathy, you had a question. Okay. When I say glaze, what exactly do I mean? A glaze, I'd actually talk about this in the new video, the difference between a glaze and a scumble. A glaze is a transparent, darker color applied over a lighter underpainting or a lighter layer. And it's transparent. That's the key. It's transparent. A scumble is an opaque or semi-opaque layer. It's not actually all that related to the technique of like scrubbing it into the surface, even though we use a very thin kind of loaded brush in that second pass. But when I'm glazing, like in the case of your painting where I wanted to shift everything over a little bit more towards the yellow, I would take that transparent red oxide, and it's really easy to overdo it. So just taking a touch of it with some of your oleo gel or your medium that you're going to use for oiling out. It can just be oil. You could also use something like Liquin or Neomegalp and do the glaze and then kind of let it dry and then do your second color pass. But if you want to kind of shift your painting that direction, you're just making a very subtle amber tint. It should not make her look orange, so if it goes down too strong, then you know, you need to dilute it with more medium. I don't know if you were part of my, I think you were, but if you took the other course where we had talked about glazing color at the very end in those bonus videos, that kind of will give you a little bit on that too. But you know, if you're kind of nervous about that, I will be doing more glazing later, so you don't have to do that. It was just a suggestion for kind of knocking it over towards that warmer tone that she has kind of quickly. You could also wait and glaze that yellow at the end, because I'll be talking about how to do that towards the end of this class, because the glazing, sometimes I like to save it for towards later in the stages. Okay, alrighty. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing your work next week. All right, enjoy the new lesson, guys.